Welcome to Fairfax County Public Library. We are delighted to have you join us as we host Great Decisions. Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on world affairs. The program meets to discuss the most critical global issues facing America today. Our topic this month is global supply chains and U.S. national security, and our guest speaker is Professor Ayman Omar. Our moderator is Mike Carpenter, a retired Foreign Service officer. So without further ado, please enjoy this video.
Assembled in China. That's what it says on the box of the latest iPhone. But the full story is more complicated. Korean batteries, Japanese cameras, Taiwanese chips, German accelerometers, Congolese minerals, all pieced together in China and sold around the world. The globalization of supply chains has made manufacturing more efficient and consumer goods cheaper. But what happens when a crisis hits? Great Decisions explores the interconnected web of the modern economy, investigates the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on international trade, and asks whether the age of economic globalization might be coming to an end. Global supply chains and national security, next on Great Decisions.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Herford Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
The ferocious spread of COVID-19 in the spring of 2020 caught hospitals unprepared.
I ain't seen nothing like this before in my life.
By April, with supplies dwindling, doctors and nurses around the country were rationing gowns and reusing face masks.
Our index case was March 1st. We knew by March 10th that we were going to be in significant trouble. We did not anticipate the profound disruption of the supply chain from China, where most of these masks came from. And as a consequence of that, we didn't just have a momentary disruption, we had a profound life-threatening disruption in our ability to procure supplies.
Widespread shortages of medical equipment called popular attention to just how much the American medical system relies on international trade.
Countries specialize in different types of equipment. Some of them export a lot of generic medicines like India and China, and protective equipment like masks or garments that help protect the healthcare workers. Those are mostly produced in China and Malaysia.
The pandemic has exacerbated long-standing concerns about how much the American economy relies on supply chains that pass through China.
We're clearly going through a period where people feel very vulnerable, and given the trade tensions with China, the U.S. is very sensitive about being reliant on China for any product or service at this point.
There's a very good reason why people started buying things from China. That was, you could go there and order anything in large quantities and get it relatively quickly. And that will be very difficult and expensive to undo.
Now, policymakers from both parties agree that the federal government must take action to secure critical supply chains.
There is a strong need for us to have reliability in our supply chain so we can take care of our own citizens should there be other health emergencies like this. And sadly, we can predict with near certainty that there will be other health emergencies like this.
Most nations that will protect fundamental things like food supply, like medicine. Not every nation has that opportunity, but we do in the United States.
The man who changed the global economy forever was a truck driver from North Carolina named Malcolm McLean. In 1956, McLean experimented with a new way to move cargo directly between trucks and ships, stacked efficiently and never needing to be repacked. The modern shipping container was born.
This cargo is going into a steel container called a cargo van. The cargo vans are proving especially useful in the safe shipment of small cargo that's more susceptible to pilferage or damage in handling.
It was actually the evolution and the introduction of the shipping container that fundamentally transformed and lowered by an order of magnitude the cost of shipping and transportation of goods all over the world.
Almost the entire post-war period up until the early 2000s, it was a golden time for international trade. Deeper engagement in international trade yielded a tremendous growth.
In the 1990s, the digital revolution spurred globalization still further. Increasingly, it was possible to manage far-flung operations over the internet.
The digital revolution created modern global value chains because with computer technologies and the falling costs of communications, it became possible for companies to break up production to maximize both cost efficiency and quality by locating wherever in the world made the most sense.
So for example, Bombardier is a Canadian plane maker, and they make parts of their business jets in central Mexico, and the rest they make in Quebec. And before the internet, there was no way they could make the tails in Mexico and the rest of the plane in Canada and hope they would fit together when you were trying to coordinate this with airmail letters and faxes.
I believe that this pandemic is going to leave us with several lessons. One is that there's greater risk to have all your employees in one place. And number two is you can achieve good efficiency because of the advances in technology, connectivity, use of the web, use of the cloud.
As the 21st century dawned, the patterns of international trade were transformed by the controversial decision to integrate China into the global economy.
In opening the economy of China, the agreement will create unprecedented opportunities for American farmers, workers, and companies.
It's the Democratic caucus of the House of Representatives that voted overwhelmingly against granting most favored nation status to China. At that time, the business interests that were for it said that granting that status would increase our trade deficit by only $1 billion a year. They were off by 30,000%.
Products are made abroad for a reason. It tends to be more efficient to do that, and we benefit enormously as consumers. You know, the cost of the things we consume has come down dramatically over the last 4 or 5 decades. But I think it is fair to say that trade competition is one of the things that has contributed to a decline in manufacturing in the United States.
Today, those who have watched the integration of the global economy most closely warn that the genie of globalization, once let out of the bottle, would be impossible to put back in.
If the U.S. just suddenly tried to dramatically decouple from China by cutting off all supplies, it's not going to work. Nobody has the manufacturing capacity that China does today, and U.S. consumers are going to pay a very heavy price if we try to sever those ties.
Historically speaking, the supply chains were made cost-effective over time. It's a natural evolution, and it's not going to disappear.
As calls for the reshoring of key industries ramp up, experts warn that policymakers must proceed with caution.
We need to be careful and thoughtful about which sectors of the economy we would like to bring home to the United States.
I think it goes back to what are the things you couldn't live without? I think certainly medicine and medical supplies would be one of them. I certainly think food is one of them. And I think energy is also one of them.
With the memory of the acute shortages from the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic still fresh, many stakeholders insist that the U.S. government should use its national security powers to promote domestic manufacture of medical equipment.
We need a national strategic plan on that. I feel very strongly that, based on this experience, that there needs to be a renewed emphasis on domestic manufacturing, period. That is a vital interest to this country, and I would say is a national security interest.
We do have a precedent in the country for demanding that certain supply chains of critical material be made in the United States. So, for example, we don't manufacture weapon systems in other nations unless they're allies. We won't manufacture them in adversary nations. We won't buy them from adversaries. We've never defined medical equipment as a critical national security supply chain, but I think the pandemic has demonstrated that we have to rethink that.
The United States is one of the biggest producers of medical equipment in the world. The US, Germany, and Switzerland are the three biggest exporters in the world. The production comes from different places, depending on the product. Now, I think the problem is if everybody wants to manufacture everything domestically, that's simply not doable.
The pandemic has also raised questions about how reliably Americans can access vital medicines in a time of crisis.
The big concern is that some critical sort of key ingredients that go into certain patent medicines, and those ingredients are sourced on a bulk basis within China. As a result of perhaps trade friction, there's been some restriction in terms of the availability of these feedstocks from Chinese factories, and thus we're starting to see, for certain types of medicines, shortages at retail pharmacies.
It's not just the manufacturing of the products themselves, but it's actually the containers in which these products will be shipped to us, the glass vials, the syringes, etc., for which demand has clearly already outstripped supply. It's also really hard to make these products de novo and in short order.
But some experts warn that those who champion self-sufficiency should be mindful of the painful lessons learned by other countries that have tried to control their domestic food supplies.
I'll give you an example. Argentina wanted to protect its beef, and they didn't want their agricultural sector to be exporting beef and making all this money while locals could not find beef. The Argentine beef business is smaller. They are not producing to full capacity. It is less profitable. Some people are going out of business.
In the British case, one of the great pushes for national self-sufficiency after 1945 came in food. The United Kingdom was unique amongst the large countries in the world in that it imported something like half its food. Now, that was thought to be dangerous in the eyes of many people.
Playing a magnificent part in restocking our larders, New Zealand is going all out to send every possible ton of meat to Britain. Records are made and broken as the food drive goes on, and it isn't only meat. Thousands of tons of New Zealand butter and apples are also filling the holds.
Through protection, through investment, the output of food increased very dramatically, such that by the 1980s, the United Kingdom was essentially self-sufficient. So the result actually was that British people ended up eating relatively expensive food, and really only the sort of foods that you could grow in this country. So I don't think it was especially good for the British diet that we had self-sufficiency in the 1970s and 1980s.
For economists and policymakers, the most concerning supply chains are those that feed high-tech manufacturing, a sector where countries around the world often rely on components produced in China.
The more challenging issue and the more difficult issue is not PPE or masks. It's sort of what to do with some of these, tech supply chains, other high-end goods, things like electric vehicles, lithium-ion batteries, semiconductors. Those are the products that also have a pretty globalized supply chain.
We've increasingly seen a convergence of commercial technologies and defense technologies and national security related technologies. We have huge vulnerabilities because of those dependencies on China.
Many experts worry that China's control over the supply of key minerals could put the U.S. at a disadvantage.
Exhibit A in that today would be rare earth materials, which are critical for pretty much every high technology application, from smartphones to electric cars to military applications of all sorts. China is the source of 80+% of the rare earth production in the world, not because rare earths are actually all that rare, but because the mining of them is very dirty and environmentally damaging, and the Chinese have been more willing to do this than other countries.
In 2010, they basically cut off our supplies of rare earths. That's a vulnerability that we have to address. These are the sorts of determinations that we have to make, partly at a political level, partly at an economic level, to determine how much we need to return to the United States.
American politicians from both parties have also tried to challenge China's dominance in the manufacture of solar panels.
This is for solar products, so that we'll be making solar products now, much more so in the United States. Our companies have been decimated, and those companies are going to be coming back strong.
But the parts that go into solar panels are produced by a complex global supply chain.
What we've witnessed in the United States since the tariffs have been implemented on solar panels is a corollary implication for a rise in cost for some of those domestic producers. The business of developing the solar industry here becomes very complex if you're not able to import low-cost products. One solar industry body actually posits that these tariffs, which have been implemented, have starved the U.S. industry of 62,000 jobs and $19 billion in capital.
We can argue on the one hand, maybe it's not a good thing that we have all the solar panels being made in China. But on the other hand, unless we're able to replicate that scale and capacity in another country or in the United States, it's very hard to argue against the positive side of it, which is a huge drop in solar prices.
As trade tensions with China grow, experts debate to what extent concerns about China can be mitigated by diversifying supply chains to other countries.
China is no longer the lowest wage economy in the world, and so people have been moving factories out of China and into Vietnam, Bangladesh, the Philippines, Mexico, and so there has been a natural diversification as people move away from China. I think that's healthy.
You can expect to see a diversification of supply chains moving forward. But one thing I will say about China is that there are many companies that are still engaged in China and indeed even increasing their investments in Chinese manufacturing. But it's primarily because of the growth of the domestic Chinese consumer.
You may not be able to have your full supply chain in your country, but if you're going to have it in another country, you want it to be one where there is geographic proximity. So in our case, we'll probably have more supply chains closer in Mexico or in Canada when they can't be in the US.
The best answer is to diversify, is to have a supply chain that is all over the world so that companies and governments don't depend on input that comes from one country or from one region.
With the most acute disruptions of the early COVID-19 pandemic in the rearview mirror, experts question whether the measures put in place to mitigate its effects might have enduring consequences for the world economy.
In the early phase of the pandemic, there was this huge scramble for medical supplies. Quite a large number of countries imposed some sorts of export restrictions on those. Those kinds of restrictions have largely faded away in terms of importance because we don't have this big shortage of medical supplies anymore.
There are restrictions that have been ongoing and intensifying even before COVID, and that may not change even when COVID is resolved.
Many countries already have restrictions on the export or even import of national security intensive goods or goods that are regarded as being important to national security. In the moment, they're a temporary expedience, but I think the experience of the pandemic is almost certainly going to lead many countries, including the United States, to try to impose more serious restrictions.
In a broader sense, the COVID-19 pandemic has magnified long-standing frustrations with an economy built on global trade.
What was happening before coronavirus was this move toward protectionism, move toward self-reliance, the tariff war, the trade war. And then on top of that came COVID. So that just added to the problems.
Free trade was in trouble before COVID. Many Americans and many people around the world were beginning to question the merits of free trade and whether free trade has indeed provided economic benefits to all members of its societies. But there is no doubt that COVID has accelerated concerns about free trade.
At a time when the benefits and drawbacks of trade have become a contentious part of the national political debate, some observers now wonder whether the era of free trade is over.
There's no question that the benefits of globalization are under fundamental attack. From the perspective here in the United States, we were winners for a long time. The last 30 years or so, relatively speaking, we've been the losers. Other countries are gaining more from trade than we are. I think what we're seeing is a partial turning inward, perhaps a correction from maybe a period in which we were over-globalized, somewhat too dependent on imports in a variety of different places.
Obviously, there's been a disillusionment with the most extreme manifestations of free trade, but I don't think that the American public is buying this. 95% of the world's consumers live outside the United States. If we're becoming more and more efficient in manufacturing goods with fewer workers, the only way we can expand jobs is to open markets around the world.
They say it's a matter of time, 1,000 days and the sun won't shine before I come back to you.
Analysts are eager to draw attention to the work behind the scenes that, despite the upheavals and uncertainties of the pandemic, has kept hospitals supplied and supermarkets stocked.
The U.S. supply chain for pharmaceutical-based products is unparalleled in the world. It is really the gold standard. Although the pandemic has stressed our system, it has remarkably held up very, very well to these stresses.
I will say that the private sector has done quite an amazing job to be able to get the supplies that we have today. And if you go to a grocery store, you'll see some out of stocks, but it is quite an accomplishment that you see the number of products that are there. And in order for those products to get there, there had to have been a tremendous amount of work and rework on a supply chain.
Around the world, consumers have become accustomed to the advantages of an economic system that has become astonishingly efficient. Cheaper goods, bigger selections, and faster delivery. But economic interdependence brings new risks. The hard-learned lessons of the COVID pandemic will loom large in the years to come as policymakers, economists, and business leaders work to prepare for the next great crisis.
Nothing's going to stop me. I'm making my way. Oh, I'm making my way. I go solo. Oh, I go solo. I'm making my way. Oh, I'm making my way.
Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on global affairs. Discussion groups meet online via Zoom and Google Meets, in person at community centers, libraries, places of worship, and homes across the country to discuss global issues with their community. Participants read the 8-topic briefing book, meet to discuss each topic, and complete a ballot which shares their views with Congress. To start or join a discussion group in your community, visit fpa.org or call 1-800-477-5836. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Herford Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
It's my great pleasure to, as moderator, to welcome today's guest discussant, Dr. Ayman Omar. Dr. Omar is the Associate Dean for Graduate Programs and Student Services at American University, where he's also an Associate Professor in the Department of Information Technology and Analytics. In addition, he is the Marvin Fair Faculty Fellow in the Department of International Business and a Research Fellow at the Kogod Cybersecurity Governance Center. His research focuses on global supply chain management, specifically its integration, flexibility, sustainability, outsourcing, greening, and cyber risks. Prior to receiving his PhD in supply chain management and logistics, Professor Omar conducted supply chain management consulting projects for a wide range of corporations from small to Fortune 100. Dr. Omar, we're honored indeed that you've accepted our invitation, and we extend to you the very warmest of welcomes. The floor is yours, sir, for your opening remarks.
Dr. Omar, you are muted.
Sorry, I was on mute. Just wanted to thank you so much, Mike, for this intro. I wanted to also thank you and the Foreign Policy Association, Mona and the rest of the library for this invite. Very excited to be chatting with everyone today, and really appreciate everybody being with us on the call. But before I get started, I just want to make sure that Mike will be sharing that beer with me later today. So
great.
Just happy to share some of the thoughts based on the stuff we've seen on the documentary, but also some of the other issues that relate to supply chain management and US national security. Before I get into some points I wanted to bring up, just wanted to make sure that we're thinking of this as there's no one size fits all in terms of solutions. We have to start segmenting the issues of by industry, by nature of products that we're talking about. Are they critical products? Are they non-critical products? Segmenting this by, are we looking at supply chains that are serving markets overseas, or those supply chains that are serving our markets? So in things we've heard in the documentary, we could have parallel supply chains, one that's focused on serving markets, for example, in China and Asia and Africa, versus those supply chains that are serving other areas. and there are pros and cons of structuring this in this way. But I know one of the things that came a lot in the documentary, and I'll try to be very brief with my comments because I want to open up the floor for discussion and having a more engaged conversation. One of the things that came up frequently in the article, but also in the documentary, was the relationship, the foreign policy relationship and trade relationship between the United States and China, and how certain policy instruments can impact or affect the supply chain structures, the trade agreements, and the movement of products back and forth. One of the things that we need to step back from this conversation, from this argument, and just think of this in a completely different way. And I think I want to be a little bit taking us to a slightly different direction. I want to be this to be a little bit critical of how we've historically tried to deal with supply chain issues. Is it's not a one-to-one. We always view supply chains in a very simplistic, linear fashion of a buyer-supplier relationship. Supply chains are much more complex than this, as you've heard from some examples. So even if we talk about products being made in the United States or products being made in China or Vietnam, the question becomes, what about the components and subcomponents of this product? Where are they coming from? How many other countries are we also interconnected with? So even if we talk about supply chains between the United States and China, the reality is that in itself includes many other components and countries that are involved in all of this process to make sure that we're getting the final products to those customers in that end. So looking at those issues, let's take a step back and think away from a one-to-one relationship versus an actually very complicated and complex global structure in place. Some of the supply chain issues that we've heard include national security concerns. And I think we've seen some of those come up during COVID. But the reality is supply chains leading up to COVID have been very fragile. They've been functioning, they've been great. And the reality is we have some of the strongest supply chains in the world. The testament is the ability to distribute the vaccines throughout the last year or so in a very quick fashion on a daily basis of almost 4 million doses a day, and being able to administer and distribute this amount in this volume throughout is a testament to the strength, the existing strength of supply chains. Having said that, that doesn't mean that those supply chains are also exposed to so many additional risks. And this is where some of that focus and attention that I think we need to bring those supply chains to. This is why we see some of the concerns right now on the West Coast ports. This is why we've had some issues coming up during the disruption from COVID. But the reality is we're going to have disrupting events as we move forward. And the question is, are our supply chains ready for that disruption, or are they just ready to function as is, but not ready to deal with the next disruption? So let's think of some of the areas that I think we really need to ramp up the strength and capabilities of the supply chains in order to be able to not just deal with the next disruption, but being able to compete and remain very, very strong. First thing that we typically do not think of in supply chains, because we think of physical product movement, it's actually the technology, the information part of this. And one of the biggest risks right now in supply chains is cybersecurity or cyber supply chain risks. The additional concern here is companies always think in a silo mentality in trying to deal with those risks of how do I manage my IT infrastructure? How do I manage my information? 2/3 of the breaches happen through a third-party entity. So no matter how much you spend and invest in internal capabilities and employee training, there's a very good chance you're still going to get breached from somebody outside. So why do I care about my supplier being breached? Because if your supplier is being breached, there's a good chance that includes your information, your intellectual property, information about your customers, about your suppliers, or even worse, financial information. Second element to this is what happens if my key supplier goes out of business and gets disrupted? Even if it doesn't impact my information, well, now this is an operational risk to my operations as well. So if my key supplier in a different country now is offline, they cannot make the products. And we've seen this in many examples. If they can't make the products right now because they've been breached, they're under ransomware attack, that impacts my operations. And for cybersecurity and supply chains, that needs to take a completely different approach of rethinking how do we reinvest in this capability. What's interesting is myself as one of my colleagues were modeling different patterns of investments. And one of the things that we thought was very interesting is you may, as organizations, you may be able to invest less money, total budget of cybersecurity investments, less money in-house, and take some of that money to go out to some of those weak links, some of the backdoor suppliers. Invest with them, because sometimes you'll go to suppliers and they'll say, we understand what you want from us, we just don't have the capability or resources to invest in our cybersecurity infrastructure. So instead of spending $100 on your organization on a yearly basis, you can actually, your total spend could be 90, and within that 90, even less on your own, but some would go out to increase the capabilities of your suppliers. And that's a much more effective approach. It's counterintuitive because I'm going to a company saying you need to spend less in total and also take some of that money and give it to your suppliers. But that's actually a much more effective way of dealing with some of those risks. The key thing here, the key message is we need to rethink how we address some of those risks in place. Key one is that cybersecurity risk that we've seen over and over. And the unfortunate joke is we talk about companies as two types: those who've been breached and they know it, and those who've been breached and they still do not know it. Our reliance on technology is going to continue to grow, which is going to continue to increase that exposure to a lot of organizations. Second part is the second topic I wanted to bring up is the ability to have a resilient supply chain. Resilient, that is, how do we bounce back in the case of a disruption? It's not just having different suppliers or shifting our production to different countries. It's also a function, again, of looking at the entire network. Because even if I shift my production to a different country or I shift my use with a different supplier, what about the subcomponents of my supplier? Where are they getting their subcomponents from? If they're getting all of their subcomponents from one supplier, so my second tier supplier, that's my supplier, if they go out of business, that impacts me as well. So looking at resiliency in a much more strategic fashion, not when a disruption happens. When a disruption happens, it's way too late to address this. So looking at the ability to be resilient, and I know everybody talks about resiliency when a disruption happens, and a few months later, everybody moves on because there are investments that need to be made. There's some strategic choices that need to be made, and we move beyond that. But as we move forward, those disruptions are going to continue to happen. Maybe not, hopefully not with the same magnitude and scope that we've seen with COVID, but we will have disruptions. In March, we had that container ship being stuck in the Suez Canal, right? And we're going to have more and more of those events happening in place. The question is, how quickly can your supply chain adjust? Maybe because it's an operational disruption. Maybe it's a political disruption. Maybe there is some issue that's happening in one location or one geographic area where now we cannot get products, or those products are much more expensive now for us to bring in. So how can we adjust quickly throughout? The third part, which I think addresses both of those components and helps us improve resiliency, is the visibility throughout the supply chain. This has been an ongoing issue, and that's one of the most important aspects. If you want to look at this from the operational lens, from the cost lens, from a national security lens, from an IT lens, from a sustainability lens, reporting, just whatever the metric, whatever the final outcome that's of a concern for the organization or the national government is, visibility cannot be stated enough of the importance of visibility. We've seen that in COVID, the inability to see what's happening upstream and downstream. Think of the example, I'll just mention a few examples of that I think will hit this home, is the pharmaceutical industry, counterfeit drugs. On an annual basis, averages of the cost of counterfeit drugs globally are 1 million deaths. Think of this, 1 million deaths because of counterfeit drugs on an annual basis worldwide. Costs somewhere between, it depends on what you look at, but the costs are somewhere between $25 to $75 billion of losses on a yearly basis, and almost a roughly average or estimation of 40,000 jobs being lost because of counterfeit drugs. Why do we have counterfeit drugs in the supply chain? Because the inability to track and trace and have visibility upstream in the supply chain. Yes, I know where my suppliers are getting their products from, but what about their supplier's supplier? What's happening upstream and downstream? we've had that same issue as well in even the food supply chain, even within the United States. So I know the food supply chain issue and food concerns and national security concerns came up during the documentary. But one of the things that we've just recently started to address was the inability to respond to food recalls in a timely fashion. Think of just food recalls. When we have a recall for spinach or lettuce or chicken or something, some food item, how long does it typically take for us to track and trace where the product came from and do a full investigation? It takes somewhere between 6 to 8 weeks. So think of this. Now I've heard that there is some concern about contamination with a food item. In order for me to do the full investigation involving the FDA and every single other entity that's in place, that takes 6 to 8 weeks for us to address. What do we do in between? We don't have the ability to keep those products on shelves for 6 to 8 weeks. So what do? We destroy all of the products. And we punish people throughout the process because we cannot track. Yes, we can track and trace, but how long does it take us to track and trace? We're not efficient in that process. So yes, we can eventually find out through an investigation, but it takes a very long time. So what do? We punish everybody else in the process because we're not sure which brand did this come from, which store did it come from, which farm did this come from. What's the average cost of one food recall? In the United States, on average, it's somewhere, just depends on the nature of and the scale of this recall and the food item itself, but we're talking about somewhere between $5 to $50 billion, B as in Bravo, $5 to $50 billion per one recall. In 2018, we've had over 25 of those food recalls in place. What's one of the solutions right now that we've got to address those, and Walmart has started implementing this with some of their suppliers, is the platform of blockchain to track and trace, simply just to track and trace, to give us more visibility. How long does it take us now to track and trace some of those food items? It takes less than 5 seconds because we have visibility. Everybody's looking at that same information. Everybody can trust that that information is true. So looking at, and again, I'm not trying to promote blockchain or not, but those are just some examples of solutions to give us, the key here is visibility. I don't care about what technology we use. The key here is how do we push for more visibility, and visibility beyond just our national borders. It's visibility across our global supply chains to be able to track and trace. Where are the products being made? How are they being made? What about labor practices in some countries? And that has been a pilot project with the Department of State as well, looking at some of the labor practices in Africa, because we need to track and trace a lot of those activities. So looking at visibility and trying to think of how do we increase and enhance? Are we going to get 100% full visibility? No, because it's almost impossible. But we can definitely improve that at a much higher level. Those would be key elements, in addition to, of course, improving the infrastructure, in addition to looking at different trade policies and instruments. But unless we've got those 3 areas in place, looking at cybersecurity risks, looking at how do you build resilience, and how do you improve supply chain visibility, we're going to be struggling with on national security related items, whether it's the physical movement of products, the loss of intellectual property for some industries and sectors, or getting unwanted products and services injected in the supply chain. So I'll stop here. I'm happy to take this conversation in any direction, but I'll stop here and see if there are any questions, comments, thoughts.
Well, Professor, thank you very much for your very introductory remarks, and you've certainly given us a lot to think about. I'll lead off, if I may, please, by saying you outline these 3 areas about the resilience, the cyber, and also the visibility. Are there some industries that you believe the U.S. should totally have control of within our own borders in order to assure complete control of the end product?
I think it's hard to have the complete industry within. I mean, that's unrealistic. I think what we need to be thinking about is within those industries, within those sectors, what kind of products or items or components we think are extremely critical that we need to have full control over what takes place in that production. And even within those components, we might have still some subcomponents that are coming from overseas. And the question becomes, how do we verify and validate the quality of those items? And the example I'm just going to mention is that for some aircraft manufacturers, a lot of their subcomponents are off the shelf. So think of a microprocessor or a chip that's off the shelf. It's very standard. It's sold everywhere, and they get this from overseas. The question and the struggle they have is, for some of those subcomponents, have they been recycled and refurbished, or are they brand new? And the difference here is the lifetime of that component or subcomponent. How do you understand the lifetime of that subcomponent if I don't have visibility in terms of where and how those products were the sub-products were being made? But of course, for some of the sectors, whether it's a healthcare industry, whether it's the national defense industry, some of those critical components could be made here. The challenge is not just the component being made, but also the subcomponents in place and the sub-assemblies and the cost of making everything in-house. And I think that's the back and forth between that decision-making process.
And there is current technology that would allow us to address all of these issues that you raised cost effectively if we had the will to apply it?
The technology is there, but the challenge is always not the technology, it's the process. It's how do we establish that process with these suppliers and my second tier suppliers in place. When it becomes a mandate by suppliers, for example, in the case of blockchain that I mentioned with Walmart, Walmart did not give an option for all of the Greenleaf suppliers to come on board with this, whether they liked it or not. They said, you've got a year to be on board. You're either one of our suppliers or not. So I think that with the technology, we can find the solution. I think it's looking at the process and understanding what kind of information do we need to get from the suppliers and how do we manage that in place. We've always also worked in a silo mentality across many organizations, but also that's a key struggle we have from a national supply chain standpoint. That's been one of the challenges we're seeing right now in the West Coast ports. Part of it is the infrastructure, but part of it is the silo mentality of not sharing information and trusting that information in place.
Mona, do we have anyone queued up with some questions?
Yes, we have a question in the chat box. How do you protect national security when nations like China provide predatory financing to drive non-Chinese competitors out of business? For example, Huawei undercutting the 5G competitors worldwide. They underbid until they're the only vendor left standing.
So that's a great question. I think with some of the bidding that takes place, I think the key thing to address this is the innovation, right? It's part of it is looking at the manufacturing side of things, but a key part of this is the innovation and design of pushing out similar products. I think in some areas the government could support some industries, but I don't think that's a sustainable strategy for a lot of industries in place. And I think that's a short-term approach. I think it's also working with this is where the policy side of things, not just with China, but who China is working with becomes very, very important. Looking at those treaties in place, looking at those arrangements in place and understanding that there's something beyond just that price to be dealt with. And what are the pros and cons of getting into that engagement with those companies or those organizations?
Mona, any other questions?
Not in the chat box just yet, but I do have some other questions here. The article that notes that the inability or extreme difficulty of avoiding Chinese-made products is a direct result of how multinational corporations in China have reconfigured the global supply chain. Thus, seemingly insatiable corporate greed and towering Chinese ambition have combined to potentially threaten America's economic and security future. Where were the Congress and the White House when this was going on?
I think they were asleep.
So, sorry, Harry, you were going to say what? Sorry.
Oh, I was saying I think the Congress and the White House were asleep, and the American public was asleep while this was going on. We're just interested in the lower prices. We weren't thinking of other implications.
And sorry, so I'll just comment quickly, and I apologize my background barking of my dog. Sorry.
Sounds like a Chihuahua.
Yeah, it's a Labradoodle, and I think we have like a shipment of delivery coming
Chihuahua.
Very big.
But he's very excited. But I think a big part of it is, again, it's a signal of how fragile the current supply chains are in terms of our reliance, whether it's on China or other areas. And I think that's where you see a minor disruption, whether it's coming from China or other countries, will have massive ramifications across, whether it's a non-critical or a critical product. And I think that's back to the issue of how do you build resilience in the supply chain? If we're getting that disruption from China or elsewhere, how do you bounce back? How do you reconfigure your supply chain? That's part of that equation. And to your comment, Harry's, it was convenient because of the low cost operations, but low cost of the supply chain itself is not sustainable as we move forward. And whether it's China or another country in the future, the same applies, right? If you're heavily reliant on just one location, expect there will be some significant disruption taking place, whether it's an operational based disruption, a policy based disruption, or something else that's happening. And how do you manage and how do you protect your critical supply chain infrastructure as well?
I've got a question. The movie talked about the interruption of global supply chains. You mentioned the COVID virus, which is a serious problem. I think a wake-up call to many Americans. But since we get so much from China, not only finished products, but parts within products, what happens if China tries to take over Taiwan? We go to war with China over Taiwan, which could happen. That supply chain from China could be shut down entirely. Then where would we be?
So I think that's it's a potential scenario. I think it's a very unlikely scenario because I think that will have massive ramifications on China as well, and it's unsustainable for their economy as well. So the thinking again of the supply chain as we're reliant on China, but they're reliant on us as well. From that regard, and short term, it's going to be a very, very tough economic decision for them to forego. I think we've also shifted production to some other locations beyond China at this point, but we're still heavily reliant on the Chinese market. And again, that's something for supply chains to consider as we move forward. There is no short-term solution for this. We can't just flip a switch and say, okay, we're going to decouple from China today or tomorrow or next week. That's where we start rethinking that strategy as we move forward. If something happens in the next week or two, unfortunately, we're heavily dependent on China and other countries as well. But that's where you start having that conversation of, as we move forward, how do we strategically make sure we're not stuck to one market in place? But that's a great point.
In addressing that point, you seem to touch upon several things. And in the conclusion of the article that we read today, the author noted 3 possible policy options for the US, and this is mainly with our relations with China. He mentioned renewed engagement with China, decouplement, and or an industrial policy adoption. Would you think that a well-conceived and targeted mix of all of those 3 would be the best approach, not just one of them? And that might also apply to a number of other countries around the world, that we need a well thought out, a well conceived approach as to what's in our best interests in these various areas, about the depth of engagement, decoupling in certain areas, and adopting an industrial policy. The author, I think, or another of the authors that we were reading today from the Hudson Institute mentioned the model of World War II and the arsenal of democracy, that there are certain things that we should concentrate on and build up and be ready for whatever comes.
So I agree. My personal thoughts would be the 3. The question is which one of them is more effective than the other, short-term and long-term. So I think engagement, there has to be continuous engagement, no question. The question is that going to be effective in changing things in the short term? Probably not. decoupling is again long-term strategy. We cannot decouple overnight, and even with the different tariffs we've seen over the last 4, 5, 6 years, back and forth, we've seen some companies exit. We've seen some companies come back into China. So we really have seen churn versus really complete exodus from the Chinese market because of the realities and the market forces that are in place. So decoupling is not an easy. And again, when we think of decoupling, are we thinking of decoupling from every single product and component we're working with? And what about if we do that, but our suppliers that are based in Vietnam or South Africa or Australia, what if those suppliers are getting their subcomponents from China? So we're still working with China indirectly. We're still dependent on China indirectly. So I think it's a much more complicated and complex decision to be made and has to be thought out in terms of when we talk about decoupling, the easiest view we have in our minds is we're just going to stop buying from that country. We may be able to do that, but indirectly, we might still be engaged with them somehow through a third party or third entity in place. And the policy adoption, of course, is important to have as one of those tools in managing that relationship.
Mona, anyone else waiting to ask a question?
Yeah, super tankers run on diesel. Is there any thoughts on how to reduce cross-ocean traffic to support greener supply chains? Battery is not an option, as that could take up half the ship. Do we return to sailing ships?
So two things. I think one is the infrastructure of the supply chain in terms of how do you make it more efficient? I think the option of not onshoring or moving back production overseas, but also nearshoring. So how do we establish where it makes sense? How do we establish production facilities that are close by, not necessarily at home, but where we can get some advantage, not just of cost, but also of accessing other markets. And specifically, I'm looking at the South American markets. Establishing manufacturing facilities in Mexico is not just about reduction in costs, but it's also access to other South American markets where they have different trade agreements. That could be one option to look at reducing shipments back and forth. The other thing is the thinking of returns. So the reverse supply chain part of this, how do we reduce the number of defective products? That reduces the carbon footprint, that reduces the amount of shipment back and forth. That's where some companies now are looking at how do you invest in the training and education of your suppliers' workers? And that gets to that sustainability part, the social sustainability, not just because it's a nice or a good thing to do, but as those workers are better trained, the number of defective products go down and the number of returns go down. So it's a win-win-win situation in that scenario. But again, to answer this question more specifically, I think it depends on the nature of the industry and the nature of how that supply chain is structured. But those would be some options to play around.
Mona, any other questions?
Yes, one question posed by this month's reading is whether China is an economic partner or strategic economic threat. It further asks whether China can be brought back into an American-led international economic system. If willing to be a partner at all, it seems that China would want to be the senior partner. And as for leading the world's economic system, it appears China is positing a new model of leadership. Would you agree?
So I agree that China is both a partner and a threat. I think the way to, again, there's no short and easy answer to decoupling or shifting completely. The reality is our supply chains are connected with the Chinese economy for a long while. And the question is, how do you manage that relationship as we move forward? Part of managing that relationship is setting up partnerships and setting up different locations, different treaties, different agreements with other entities, having additional coalitions in place, having different supply chain coalitions, not just political coalitions, but different supply chain coalitions in place.
Speaking of China, we seem to be becoming very China-centric here in our conversation, but Do you have any idea of what have the nations in the Trans-Pacific Partnership done to address the China challenge? And shouldn't the U.S. now become a member of that TPP organization? We haven't as yet, although I think it was largely our idea to begin with.
I think, so I'll start with the last one. I think I would agree. My personal view is I think the US definitely should be part of the TPP. A big part of this was initially to counter the threat, or at least diffuse some of that threat that we've discussed today. TPP was never about trade. It was about national security. It was about foreign policy, more than just economic trade. And I think they're not mutually exclusive, but the main key aspect of this was back to my earlier point of those kinds of coalitions. This is where you start countering some of the strength, the impact, the issues of undercutting prices in different markets based on just trying to dominate those markets. So I think that could be one step in that direction. I don't think TPP is just sufficient by itself, but that's an example of more things that could be done.
Any questions, Mona?
Yes, another one here. The Hudson Institute's Arthur Herman says that America needs an industrial policy harkening back to the 1940s and the US's years as the arsenal of democracy. He calls for the development of a comprehensive strategy, firm, persistent presidential leadership, close coordination with allies, and a reform of the status quo driving towards a unity of effort. Does this make sense to you? And if so, can it be attained in our present divisive atmosphere?
With some nations, yes. But again, the nature of challenges we've had in the past, and I'm not even talking about the 1940s, but even in the past 30 years or 40 years ago, that's very different than how we're moving forward in the next 5 to 10 or 20 years. The nature of technology, the nature of 3D printing, the nature of a lot of new startups in place. This is where, again, the shortage in supply we have right now with workers. If I'm sure everybody's been very, very familiar with the shortage in restaurant staff or employees or just drivers. That has been because there's a massive shift right now in small startups that are much more focused on growth as opposed to bottom line profits. And that's shifting a lot of the labor supply, right? Which has massive ramifications to other industries that we have here and overseas. So I think looking at some of those trends of startups, of technology, of again, some of the different risks, that I think would inform our discussions or our relationships with other nations. And what's key and critical for us, it's not just about the physical product movement, it's about the information flow and sharing. Think about what was one of the biggest concerns and the back and forth we've had in TPP discussions. It was related to intellectual property rights. And that's one of the key things as we move for us, intellectual property rights, information security, and that's a big aspect of national security. It's not hard to imagine what happens when the internet goes down on the East Coast or the West Coast or just one company or so, how much disruption that takes place. And think of that as being a massive disruptive force in our global supply chain. And also the thing to think about is not just if it's happening here in the States, what if it's happening in a different country that's now impacting our supply chains of getting goods, specific goods and products also?
So can you speak to the issue of rare earth elements? What options do we have as a nation?
So China has been aggressively investing in the farming of rare earth elements, of producing and mining those elements in place because of the simple nature of how this impacts one of the booming areas, which is the lithium batteries, for example, the electric vehicles. Thinking of this is the one of the critical components for the auto and manufacturing industry in place. Looking at, for us, the solution is going to be, if the supply is not enough in the United States, where else can we start partnering with countries or nations where that could be a steady and sufficient supply for the auto industry. Again, think of how much the auto industry, and that's why my earlier comments about not thinking of issues we've had 30 or 40 years ago, but as we move forward, as electric vehicles become more in demand out there, how can we adjust? How can we ensure that that supply is steady, whether it's at home or overseas?
So how well is the US positioned to compete with China? They're 4 times as large, they have a huge internal market, they have less expensive and more competitive labor, etc.
Right now, the answer is not very, but the good news is we still have some time to work on this. This is, again, not something we can flip a switch, but I think there has to be a strategic vision and steps towards making sure that in 5 years from now, in 10 years from now, we're not caught off guard of being in very short supply and we can't access that supply, or that supply has already been partnered with somebody else that may not be in a very favorable policy position to us.
Thank you.
So you're saying then that the pandemic has finally gotten the attention of the country at large, and particularly our government in Washington?
Unfortunately, I don't think so, but I hope they do. And this is not a take on any policy or any administration or any party. I think that the fear I have is, again, because this is a big issue, just like a lot of organizations, of how they react when there's a problem. Everybody's paying attention, and then as soon as that problem subsides, it's back to business. And the question is, how do we start taking this and putting away any political maneuvering around this? Again, putting away all of the politics aside and thinking of this strategically for how do we look at critical industries for us, the auto industry and others, and how do we ensure their survival as we move forward and their ability to compete in those markets? Because think of the electric vehicle. Now we don't have 2,000 subcomponents in that car. What's the only important component in that car? It's the battery. We don't have access to the battery. What else is left in the car? It's some technology that we can get anywhere and the mainframe of the car, and that's it. But the main component now, it's not the combustion engine, it's not the diesel engine, it's a battery. And whoever's going to have full access to not just regular batteries, but again, that's where the technology is going to, and the innovation of, and maybe we don't think of lithium batteries. Maybe there are other kinds of batteries that we start thinking of developing that would replace this kind of technology in place. So whether it's lithium-based batteries, whether it's completely different technology for batteries, but the key component for that industry as we move forward are the batteries. How do we design, how do we innovate in this subcomponent? And if we need certain aspects or certain supplies or components or subcomponents of this product, where do we get it from? And how do we establish those strategic partnerships from now, not in 5 years or 10 years from now?
Doesn't that, though, again, raise the question of a national industrial policy? That there are certain sectors that should be inspired to devote energy, attention, and investment on these areas, lest we be caught again in a situation like this. And I can't see it getting any better in the future. I mean, in terms of the possibility of impacts across a whole wide area of goods and products.
Absolutely, and I think, sorry, go ahead.
Could I interject a cautious note about industrial policy? I guess one possible lesson of the pandemic is the supply chain, the global supply chain, was remarkably resilient given the pressure it was under. And some of the problems we've encountered have been due, for example, semiconductors have been due to misguided protectionist policies on the part of the previous administration. So I would, and when you start talking about World War II policies, arsenal of democracy, those were extraordinarily expensive, and some of those, there's a long history of enormous amount of waste, stockpiling of resources that have gone unused because of non-existent risks or threats. So I guess my question is, how much of a problem do we have with the global supply chain? And how much of a potential threat do we have from governments adopting protectionist policies that interfere with this existing supply chains and make things worse rather than better?
So I'll start with the first one with how, sorry, your first question was how good or how strong are the current supply chains in place? Is that correct?
Yes.
So I think, again, back to my earlier comments, I think there's good news and bad news. The good news is we have some of the best supply chains that exist. That's, again, a testament of the ability to distribute and give out the vaccines. There's no question that without having very strong supply chains and infrastructure in place, that's not something that you can just bring up or develop overnight. Globally, yes, it's functioning on a daily basis. Having said that, there are lots of areas of potential exposure for the supply chains. And that's where we see a disruption happening, disruption operationally, disruption because of the pandemic, disruption because of some policies. I don't think as much as people talk about protectionist policies in some countries, they may be short-lived, they may be exciting for political purposes. The reality is a lot of economies are interdependent on different components and products and supply chains. That's the reality. Whether, again, I'm not saying this is good, this is bad. That's just the reality of where things are. So it's extremely hard to put a very strong protectionist policy that really impacts a lot of nations in place without it taking down that country as well that's putting it as well. It's it's just a recipe for suicide for those nations who are doing this because it's not realistic, it's not practical. And even if we talk about the one-to-one relationship, even if I say I'm not going to be getting products from country X, the reality is I'm just changing partners. I'm getting it from country Y or country Z or a different country in nature. So it's just the musical chairs, even if we talk about a specific partner not being the correct partner in place. But generally speaking, the reference towards the end of the movie is this the end of globalization? The answer from my end would be no. We might have different partners, different entities working together, different treaties and different teams in place. And even across different sectors, those teams could look very different. But the reality is there's always going to continue to be need for expanded, whether it's production, whether it's access to markets, a combination of both, and just the reliance on other sources of supply and getting that the diversification and resilience in place.
Thank you. We have another question. Will better recycling help to recover fundamental materials?
Absolutely, and this is where the push and again, this has started from the private sector. So just a quick example is if you've got a Dell or a Hewlett Packard computer or most computers and you return it, it's not the same company that takes this back. It's a third-party entity that deals with credits, but more importantly, that deals with refurbishment, recycling, remanufacturing, and reusing those components. So we look at closed loop supply chains. This is not a new concept. We've talked about this a lot, trying to explain how we can retake the value of certain products and components. And I think that's where the comment of recycling will help recover those materials. Refurbished does not mean necessarily bad quality. Refurbished could be very good quality as equal as new. It's just the process of how you refurbished or remanufactured a product that could be different. And I think that's where my earlier comment about the defense suppliers or the DoD suppliers that are working on aircrafts of getting off-the-shelf components and making sure that those are just the same standard, even if it's recycled, but it's a specific standard to make sure the lifetimes or the life cycle of that component is as to what's expected. So no question, there's going to be much more pressure to recycle. What's even more important is where do we recycle? Do we ship the products to be recycled out back, or do we establish recycling close to where the customers, clients, or usage is? And I think the answer is the second one, because with that, we cut transportation back and forth. This is where we cut emissions early on. This is where we cut diesel consumption of cargo ships again. It might be slightly expensive in the short term, but long term, this gives us responsiveness, quick turnaround time, more efficiency throughout the supply chain, and a much smarter way to approach this.
Isn't Is the real answer to this whole question of supply chains and the vulnerabilities we have in certain countries, just widespread diversification? I mean, as you said, let's diversify to Mexico, let's diversify to Canada. What about Japan? What about Vietnam? What about a lot of countries around the world? And maybe they get their parts from China, but if you diversify to enough different countries, then I think you're spreading your risk around.
So I think diversification is definitely one of the solutions. I think how much and which components and where to becomes that discussion and question. Diversification comes with a cost because you lose economies of scale. You start getting into a more complicated supply chain. So I think diversifying in a smart way would be the solution. Yes. Would be one of the solutions. But again, it depends on the nature of the industry and the components we're looking at and the criticality of that component as well.
Let me ask one other question. We always hear about China and how China is rapidly growing economic power and will soon overtake the United States. But I'm not so sure that's true. China's been growing rapidly, but China was starting from a very much lower base than the United States. I mean, the Chinese were practically destroyed after the Second World War. So yeah, they've grown a lot, but they've had a lot of mountains to climb to get to where they are now. And how long can that continue? What they're dependent upon is the freedom and resilience and the imagination and the hard work of the Chinese people. And it seems to me that the government of China now is cracking down on freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and making it more difficult for the Chinese to pursue their own economic gains and pursue their own ideas. It's the Chinese people that have made China great, not the government. I think the government's getting in the way now.
It's a great point. How long does that continue on? I really don't know, but we'll have to wait and see. I honestly don't have an answer, but welcome any thoughts on this point from anybody else on the call.
Well, I won't hazard a thought on that. It's rather an imponderable so far as I'm concerned, but I did want to touch on the physicality of supply chains, if I could, for a moment. The article touched on this, and the pandemic has exposed weaknesses in our nation's transport plumbing, if you will. There have been investment shortfalls at key ports, the railroad industry labor cuts, chronic failure by the key players to collaborate and to facilitate their systems. President Biden has been quoted as saying that he has a passion for port development. He was quoted in 2014 as saying this, in his infrastructure building package that's before the Congress has $17 billion allocated to modernize our ports. But beyond ports and other areas, to borrow a phrase from President Biden, how do we build back better on the supply chain side?
I think it's a combination. I think definitely the infrastructure is key because the infrastructure has not kept up with the volume of trade and the ships that are coming with bigger volumes of products. For ships, we've seen more and more bigger ships that are coming because of economies of scale. It's much cheaper to ship more on one ship versus multiple ones. So we're seeing bigger container ships coming on the ports, which means more products at a time. It means a rush based on the current capacity. And again, we talk about disruption. A very small disruption in those ports could have a major domino effect in terms of how products are delayed and so on. Think of what we go through in the airports if one flight is delayed or a few flights are delayed, and just the chaos that takes place across and all of the disruptions. So think of that as containers now. And yes, a lot of ports are working 3 shifts, which is a good short-term solution right now for the congestion we're seeing, but long-term that capacity has to increase. In addition to the capacity, again, the earlier discussion we've had on visibility in terms of where those products are coming from. Can we reroute the products if there is a congestion in place? That takes not just technological devices to share information. I think it's rethinking the process of sharing information. Who are we sharing this information with? What kind of information are they seeing upfront and ahead of time? And how can we make those decisions, whether that decision is based on the port authority or a decision based on the organization that's making the products, getting the products, or even the container ships. So a combination of infrastructure, but also the visibility of information of what's flowing, how, and when.
Sticking with ports, our major ports are LA, Long Beach, I take it Baltimore, certainly, New Orleans. What other major ports do we have in the country? And then is there a particular port model for processing around the world? Perhaps a port like Rotterdam? Is there any super sophisticated port that we could perhaps learn from if we're going to try to build back better with that $17 billion?
So I think the biggest, 1/3 of the import of products coming into the US come through the West Coast. The rest is split across different ports you mentioned and others. But the 1/3 of the imports are coming through the Newport Beach and the LA ports. The Rotterdam could be a great model. Of course, the Dubai Authority model, port framework is great, but their volume is completely different than the volume we deal with in the United States. So even if that model is great to work with, that model may not work at the same capacity and the same resources that we've got here in place. So I think getting that solution of what models, I think that's easy to get at, whether it's the Rotterdam port or other ports in place. I think it's more of a mindset. It's more the culture, the mentality of moving away from a silo activity. Even if we get great ports, having that silo mentality of dealing with the operations is still going to cause those bottlenecks or cause the domino effects in place. There's a online simulation called the beer game. I don't know if anybody's played this before. Whenever I bring this up in front of my students, everybody raises their hands and say, yes, we've played the beer game before. And my first comment is, yes, I know you've played this, but it's probably a different simulation and different game. So this was designed by folks at MIT. It simulates the lack of visibility throughout the supply chain with a very, very simplistic structure of a supply chain. And you see how many times people will mess up going through that simulation. And the whole point is, if you've got a very simple supply chain in place, but it's structured in that way, and you continue to mess up trying to manage that, what do you think is going to happen in a real world complex supply chain unless you address those things? And one of the main things you need to address is that visibility of information upstream and downstream. Right now, we don't have that in place, and it's still a very siloed approach to dealing with local supply chains or national supply chains. Part of it is the trust as well. How do we trust? Who do we share information with, and so on?
One tires of hearing about silos. My mind flashes back to post 9/11, where, of course, there were the silos where intelligence wasn't shared, and we reaped the whirlwind for that. How do we knock down those silos? Again, going back to some sort of a national policy, it would seem that the criticality of this moment indicates that the federal government should get involved, certainly working with state governments, with local port authorities and what have you, and trying to take down the silos and concentrate on this. It's sort of like the Japanese concept of just-in-time manufacturing, that you have to have something that flows seamlessly. There must be models out there that we can follow in this regard.
It starts with taking that initiative. It has to be a private-public partnership. It can be all just on the government. It can be all just in the private sector due to the nature of where the products are moving back and forth. It can be done. It just needs to be pushed through and people to understand. Just like what happened with the food safety program that Walmart has implemented. It's a public-private setup. The FDA is involved. The private sector is involved. Technology companies are involved. Trucking companies are involved. So it involves multiple entities in both the public and the private sectors. I think it came to a point where everybody realized how painful it is to go through each one of those food recalls, and that's what triggered that push. I think now is a great opportunity with everything that's happening on the West Coast ports. Hopefully that triggers that conversation between both the government and the private sector.
Before this discussion, you and I were chatting briefly, and I'd mentioned that I just read recently that in June, the White House had established a supply chain task force with the Secretary of Transportation, Secretary of Agriculture, and Secretary of Commerce at the head of it. It was the first time I'd heard of it. Now, 4 months later, if you're at all familiar with it, are they doing anything? Are they beginning to address these issues holistically? And again, working certainly with the private sector, getting the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, for example, involved in National Manufacturing Association, et cetera, et cetera.
I know some of those topics were up for discussion for that task force. I honestly don't know how much of this has been furthered in terms of the conversation, any implementation that is taking place. So it's hard for me to really tell.
Mona,
I think it's a great first step to at least formalizing the push on that. No question.
Given the importance of this topic and the complexity of the topic, do you think our federal government, both the legislative and the executive branches and the American people, are really up to grappling with these issues?
I think not by themselves. I think in consultation and working in partnership with the private sector, because we have excellent private sector supply chains. I think that's where the public-private partnership would take place. Putting this all on just the government is not the solution, or vice versa. It has to be a tandem effort.
All right, so work with the private sector, of course.
Yes. Again, think of disaster relief efforts. Some of the companies that are best equipped to help in disaster relief effort scenarios are usually the private sector because of existing supply chains that they've got in place. So there's no need to recreate the wheel. Again, the vaccination efforts, the reason why they were very successful and they were able to ramp up volume a lot was the usage of existing supply chains in the private sector, whether it was through pharmacies, grocery stores, just massive retail chains. They had their supply chains existing, set up, functioning. So there's no need to recreate that thought. It's how do we take this and improve some of the deficiencies as opposed to doing things in parallel.
Mona, any other questions and waiting in the wings?
Yes, there's a statement here. It seems that the US policy is frequently inconsistent. For example, the US wants to move to solar energy, but 67% of the photovoltaic cells or solar panels are manufactured in China, whereas 1% are manufactured in the US. They estimate it will take a decade to reverse the ratio. Do you agree?
If the production is solely based in the United States, probably yes. The question is, can you rely on production or supply from other countries in parallel to, again, diversify that risk until that effort is reversed? Yes.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question here in the chat. It says, it's asking, trucking is the major bottleneck in the transportation system, and we had spoken about trucking earlier on. Are there any ideas on how to remake that system to make it more attractive to drivers to do that work? For example, treat the containers like packets in a packet network so that most routes are short-haul relays.
So this is a great question, a great idea. I think part of what we're seeing right now in the West Coast issues is a combination of capacity at the ports, more products coming in, but also shortage of truck drivers. And the shortage of truck drivers has been an issue for a long time. Now we're just seeing this extended more. Part of it is the working conditions. Part of it is now the truck drivers are seeing much better paying jobs in new startup companies that we've referenced earlier in our conversation, of those startup companies paying much more, having shorter working durations, more flexibility, and it's a no-brainer for those folks to switch jobs. So I think having short-haul relays, having more flexible hours potentially could start putting back some of the drivers back to the industry. But it's been it's been a concern for the industry for a long time now, and the industry hasn't changed much in terms of their operations. So maybe that would be a start.
Sir, isn't part of the problem also that the truck drivers see that trucks are going to be automated and they're going to eventually, the next half dozen years, lose their jobs anyway?
Could be, but it's not that hard when you're getting X and somebody gives you 2X today to switch jobs. You're getting that opportunity in a very different environment. It's again with the startup, and this is data coming straight from, so I can't say the name of the company, but this is data based on some of the shortages that we're seeing, that where a lot of the shift of employees, especially truck drivers, is based on those new startups that are offering a significantly more pay, more flexible hours, better conditions. So it's not that hard to switch. Even if I'm concerned about things in the industry in a few years, yes, but as of now, it's not a hard sell for me to switch very quickly. And starting from a point where there was a shortage to start with in that industry, now we see a much bigger gap in place. So over the last year or 2 years, I think that gap has jumped from 60,000 to almost over 100,000 in shortage.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It looks like there might be an opportunity for me out there if I wanted to start a second career then.
Absolutely.
Mona, any other questions?
Yes, there's the current disruption in global supply chains has been a major contribution to inflation. The Fed says that prices will not stabilize until supply chain bottlenecks have cleared. Is there any way to predict when the supply chains will become fully functional again?
I wish I did, but the question is, what do we mean by fully functional? Is it pre-COVID? Because pre-COVID, they weren't fully functional. They were still very fragile. So the question is, where do we want to get them to? I think the other way to look at this is, as we move forward, how do we even make them better than what they were, where they were fully functional? Because just functional doesn't mean that they are resilient. Functional doesn't mean that they are secure. And I think those were the two areas that were missing from the previous structure of our supply, or the previous version of our supply chains before COVID. And again, what COVID has done is just exposing some of those flaws in place, right? It hasn't changed the nature of how the supply chains are. It just has exposed the deficiency that we might have in some of those supply chains. The other big gap that as a nation we need to work on, both private sector and public sector, is how do we look at risks? Because we talk about disruption. How do we look at risks? We always think of risk as this is a one extreme, once in a lifetime event. Well, now we're seeing more and more of those. So maybe the process and approach of how we even manage risk, how do we quantify risk? I'm sure a lot of us has seen the 2x2 matrices of looking at risk management of high impact, high probability, and they really don't mean much, because we're not quantifying those potential risks in terms of potential damages. Because the minute we start quantifying this, that's where we start looking at seriously, how much investments do we need to have in place, as opposed to saying it's a high and low risk, it's a high and low impact, which really means nothing.
In other words, could you almost characterize the fallout from the pandemic as a welcome wake-up call?
I hope so. And again, it's, when we look at risks and we say this is a high probability, well, high probability, and I'll ask graduate students in class and even execs, when we run this with organizations, I'll say, okay, I'm telling you this risk is a high probability. Can you write down from 0 to 100 a number attached to high probability? And we'll get anywhere between 25 and 99. And I say, just telling me high probability doesn't mean much. But also look now at high impact. When I say a certain scenario or a certain situation or a certain event, if it takes place, that's high impact. What does high impact mean? Because for me, it might mean something completely different to Mike versus Harry versus somebody else. High impact, are we talking about 50,000, 1 million, $100 million? And as we start quantifying those risks, even if it's a range, it doesn't have to be an accurate number, even if it's a range, that's much better for me to work with. And we can run pre-existing simulations in terms of what kind of losses are we looking at this year if those events take place based on a Monte Carlo simulation or any kind of simulation. And that in itself will tell me how much do I need to invest based on my willingness or risk averseness in certain situations. So that changes the complete dynamics of how we deal with risk and how we manage risk, including, of course, supply chain risks.
You mentioned your students from time to time. When these students graduate, could you give us some examples of where they might insert themselves in the whole supply chain universe to begin work and to hopefully make things better?
So first, some organizations, there'll be a supply chain analyst. It depends on which program they're coming out of. But in some organizations, they might be supply chain analysts. In some organizations, they might be working as part of a strategy or a consulting company that's helping other companies look at their supply chain strategies. So it varies based on the program, and it varies based on the nature of where they're coming from. But looking at, in our program, it's not hardcore programmers, it's not hardcore people running code. It's the ability to understand some of the technical requirements, but combine that with business decisions and understanding what does that mean now? How do we apply this? If we're looking at implementing a new platform to help us with supply chain visibility, what are the pros and cons of different platforms? And then which one would be best suited in this situation for this multinational company or this small startup?
Mona, what other questions might we have lined up?
We have another question here. For the last 4 decades, China has been on the ascendant, but now its potential growth and productivity is slowing. Demographic changes, a financial system that continues to keep bloated state-owned enterprises and the local government firms afloat, and domestic debt due to overbuilt infrastructure are concerns for China's leadership. Might these developments make them more amenable to economic cooperation?
Potentially, yes, but that's based on rational thinking and decision-making. Sometimes there's an additional element to this of, whether it's to get more political power, maybe more other areas, but I think the key is where they're going to be more amenable to economic cooperations is, again, more political engagement from the US side with other nations or other groups of nations as well, of having those coalitions in place. And that's where you start having more leverage and more strength in those negotiations. Because now you include more entities in that, again, thinking of the supply chain of nations, now you include more of those entities. Now it becomes a critical block. Now it becomes a much harder element to deal with.
Mona, any other questions, or are we headed to an early wrap up today?
Oh, I have one more question.
Alrighty.
The intentional withholding by China during the pandemic of medical supplies previously shipped to the US revealed a strategic supply chain vulnerability. China has also used this tactic with other countries that have incurred its displeasure. Doesn't this point up to the need for the US to become totally self-sufficient in indispensable items?
For some components, potentially, yes, if they're of a strategic nature or national threat, yes. Again, it depends on what items. Are we going to be fully self-sufficient? The answer is no, definitely not in the short term. And even when we say self-sufficient, does that mean we're making for that item or product, or are we making all of the subcomponents also in the United States? Because if we're still reliant on some subcomponents from overseas, then we haven't really addressed that issue of being self-reliant. So I think for some components, again, whether we talk about critical parts that we need, maybe there could be a good discussion of which ones we should keep here versus not. Are we going to be fully reliant? Maybe not. That's where we start looking at different partners for those similar components, not just from China, but elsewhere as well. And the question, I think we have to step back and think of, why was the decision made to get those products from overseas? Was it purely a cost decision? Was it the inability to make it overseas, or what?
Any other questions, Mona? Are we?
Yes, we have one more here. Will the Belt and Road Initiative have any impact on the supply chain for the US and the world?
That's a great question. It's hard to tell in the short term. We'll just have to wait and see. It's very, very hard to tell. I wish I could give you a better answer, but it's just very hard to tell at this point.
As long as we're looking into the future, do you have any predictions, or would you care to make any wagers on when we'll begin to approach normality again in our supply chain inflows here in the US?
I think for most of the ports, and again, as a testament to a lot of the good supply chains, we have seen a shortage in some products, but we haven't seen the stores entirely empty for an extended periods of time. Maybe for some products, yes, for some items, yes, but for the majority of items, I think there was sufficient supply throughout a very, very tough, unprecedented times for global supply chains. And again, this is the perfect storm of where everything is shutting down at the same time. It's not just one country, it's not just one port. I mean, disruption was happening at every single country in almost the same duration. I think things are picking up a little bit as we move forward. And I think probably by next summer, if not end of next year, I think things will be in a much better position. The bigger question is, what do we learn from this exercise, from this major disruption? Yes, it's uncommon. It's not your typical disruption because of the nature of the scope and scale. But we will have disruptive events happening regardless as we move forward in the next month, 2 months, or next year. And how do our supply chains address and respond to those disruptions? In the short term, the answer is they're not well equipped. And I think the smarter organizations, nations will start thinking of how to retool those supply chains to build that resiliency in place, to build that visibility in place, to understand where the medical equipment is in different locations. Are they being withheld by some suppliers in some countries, and being able to respond to those risks, specifically looking at, I don't want to say new emerging risks because that has been around for a while, but now we recognize the severity of those kinds of risks, like cyber risks.
Well, you mentioned the short term. I can only hope that little Betty is able to get her latest Barbie doll by this Christmas. Because I noted Fox News is already referring to our president as the Grinch who stole Christmas. So there are political dangers looming in the future, I'm afraid, for some people. Mona, if there are no other questions, please tell me if there are or not. And if not, I think it falls to me to thank very sincerely our speaker for the day. It's been a fascinating discussion, and one to which you've really contributed to our knowledge on this subject. It's not something that one thinks about every day, but it certainly hit us right in the face this past year, and you've helped to clarify the problems that begat this issue, our current state, and where we should be going in the future. And hopefully we do, and do quickly and well.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate the invitation, and happy to follow up on any of those items and conversation with anybody who's interested. So again, thank you so much for the invite.
Thank you again.
Thank you,
Dr. Omar.
Thank you
and
so much.
Great deciders out there, if you'd please mark your calendars for our next Great Decision session. That's coming up on Friday, November the 19th at 2 p.m., when we'll be addressing the future of Persian Gulf security. Our guest speaker will be Dr. Dania Thafer, Executive Director of the Gulf International Forum. I hope to see you all then, and I hope soon, Mona, that I can come over to the library and get my sandwich and my beer.
Perfect. Yes, anytime. Okay.
Very good. Very good. I worked my fingers to the bone today.
I wouldn't mind a beer. He gets kind of raucous.
All right.
Well, many thanks to Professor Omar, Mike Carpenter, and to everyone. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you all very much. Really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.